Welcome to another lecture of Psychology 101. This is your instructor, Dr. Shadi Bashai, and in today's lecture, we will finish discussing our unit on personality psychology, and this corresponds to chapter 14 of your textbook, so here we go. Last time, we discussed the beginnings of trait theories of personality. Trait theories by Allport and Eysenck culminated in one of the most studied and scientifically supported of all trait theories. And we call that theory that both of these theories culminated in the 5-factor model of personality, or the Big Five. As mentioned, this theory resembled the lexical approach, or came out of the lexical approach that was adopted by Allport, if you remember what that was from the last lecture. And this is the approach in which Allport factor analyzed the relationship between thousands of different trait words. Using factor analysis, these two researchers, McRae and Costa, they found that there are 5 basic dimensions of personality that pretty much summed up all the words we use to describe people's personalities. Since these 5 traits are big concepts, which are made up of other small personality tendencies, researchers like to think of the Big 5 traits, or the Big 5 dimensions of personality, as super traits, which are made up of smaller traits or tendencies or dispositions, if you will. The first of these 5 dimensions of personality is openness to experience. So that's one end of that continuum. On the other end of that continuum is being cautious or being closed to experience. The other dimension, or the second dimension, is conscientiousness versus undirectedness. The third, extroversion versus introversion. Fourth, agreeableness versus antagonism. And then finally, neuroticism versus emotional stability. Given that Eysenck's trait theory inspired the Big 5 theory of personality, you'll probably recognize 2 of Eysenck's personality traits that he came up with in his factor analysis, namely extroversion, introversion, which is this one, as well as what Eysenck called neuroticism and emotional stability, which is this one. So let's discuss each of the 5 traits in a little bit more detail. So as I described, I want you to think of your own or a close person's personality as I describe these 5 different traits. And I want you to imagine, where do you sit on each of these dimensions? Or where does that person that you're rating sit on each of these dimensions? This is to help you make it a little bit more concrete, help you make it a little bit more real. The first of which is openness to experience, which is your tendency to be open to new experiences, your curiosity, your inventiveness, if you will. So that's one end of that continuum. On the other end of the continuum, there is cautiousness. Someone who is inhibited, for example, from new experiences. People higher on openness to experience tend to appreciate things like art, unusual ideas, for example, and are generally just more open to unconventional ideas and even unconventional behaviors, if you will. Conscientiousness is the second personality trait here. Or the personality dimension. And this is your sense of organization, your sense of efficiency, if you will. So it's your sense of dutifulness, if you will, your long-term planning tendencies. So that's one end of the conscientiousness continuum. On the other end, there is someone's tendency to be easygoing, even on the more extreme end of the low conscientiousness continuum, people tend to be careless. Extroversion is the third personality dimension, and That's the tendency to be outgoing, as the name implies. So the tendency to be outgoing, the tendency to be energized by other people's presence, and the tendency to seek stimulation in the company of other people. Introversion, on the other end of that continuum, is the preference for isolation and the experience of almost an energy drain in the presence of other people. Okay? There is agreeableness, which is your tendency to be friendly and your tendency to be non-confrontational, your tendency to be compassionate and trusting of other people. People low on agreeableness, on the other hand, tend to be cold, described maybe as unkind, maybe suspicious of others. Finally, and the fifth personality dimension that Costa and McRae found and put in their five-factor model of personality is neuroticism, which is basically the tendency to experience negative emotionality, the experience to be unsettled or to be anxious and nervous, for example. So that's on the high end of the neuroticism continuum. On the low end, you tend to get the opposite of all that, which is the tendency to have low negative emotionality on average. They're not, people low on neuroticism are typically less sensitive than people that are higher on neuroticism, and typically less anxious and less depressed. So again, these are averages, these are general tendencies. And if you've been following, the acronym for the five personality traits, they all have the acronym of OCEAN, if you're reading here. This is to help you remember what the five factors actually stand for. So the big five, or the five-factor model of personality, has stuck around for a very long time for a reason. And that reason is it predicts many important real-world outcomes. For example, conscientiousness, again, your tendency to be organized and planful, is correlated positively, we find out, with things like work and school performance. Being high on conscientiousness and high on agreeableness and low on neuroticism, turns out they all, having this particular personality configuration, predicts better physical and mental health. We also know that the basic five-part structure of personality is actually replicated across cultures. So in most other cultures we tested, and we've conducted similar factor analyses with the words that they use to describe personality in their language, we still find this basic five-part structure to personality. However, different cultures may actually display different levels of these traits on average, for example. I'll give you one example here. For example, individualistic cultures, which are cultures that value the needs of the individual more than the group or the collective. People who are from cultures who are individualistic usually have higher openness to experience and lower agreeableness than people who come from collectivist cultures. And people from collectivist cultures tend to be ones that value the collective harmony and the goals and the needs of the group or the collective over the needs and goals of the individual. The big five, the five-part model of personality has been tested in longitudinal studies, and the results of these studies demonstrate that our personality changes very slightly during our adolescence and early adulthood, but then begins to be relatively stable after the age of 30. For the most part, your personality stays pretty stable across time. However, we've also designed drugs, psychopharmacological drugs and interventions, that can actually modulate or change your personality. I'll give you an example of something called the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs for short, which are actually commonly prescribed antidepressants. We know that these drugs can actually reduce neuroticism levels, for example. So our ability to alter personality this way offers an interesting ethical question. Just because we can alter personality in this way, should we? If you're still not convinced of the level of empirical support for the five-factor model of personality, or the Big Five, let me review more evidence here to just really put the nail in that coffin, if you will. We have tens of twin and adoption studies that now confirm the genetic stability of the personality on the five-factor model of personality. That is, ratings on the five factors correlate among genetically related people more so than they correlate amongst people that are not genetically related. So there's some genetic evidence here to support the five-factor model of personality. As mentioned, we try to replicate the basic five factors across different cultures, and we actually find a lot of support for this. We find that the five-factor structure replicates in many different languages. As mentioned, we also have longitudinal studies that show how stable personality structure is across time. So there's lots of research support for the five-factor model of personality. Some of the newest research is showing us something very interesting. There may just be a sixth personality dimension, and researchers are calling that particular dimension the honesty-humility dimension of personality. And this is your tendency to be honest in your communications and humble. So that's on the high end of honesty, humility. On the low end of honesty, humility, there's the tendency to be greedy, deceitful, conceited, for example. With the introduction of the sixth new dimension, the researchers are now calling the new six-part structure of personality the hexaco model of personality, since, of course, a hexagon has six sides. People who are very low on the sixth factor of honesty, humility, display what researchers actually call the dark triad, which is having signs of three features of personality known to be associated with crime and dishonesty, etc. And these three signs or signs of a dark triad are Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy. Machiavellianism is the tendency to believe that the ends justify the means, or to justify doing something awful for what you believe is a bigger cause or a bigger goal later on. Narcissism is one sense of inflated self-ego, while psychopathy is having a disregard for other people's needs and basically being manipulative and aggressive without any kind or showing any kind of remorse. Like any other theory before it, and like other theories that will come after it for sure, the Big Five model of personality and other trait models of personality are definitely not without their criticism. One big criticism is that your scores on these traits is not necessarily a very good predictor of how well or how you'll behave in specific situations. So this is to say that scores on the Big Five, they actually predict your behavior on average on the aggregate whole, so they can't really predict how you're going to behave in one particular specific situation. So they're aggregate level data that may not help us at all with the specifics of everyday behavior, if you will. The second big problem is that it's a very descriptive theory of personality. That is, it tells you this is how personality is, as opposed to this is where we get our personality from, for example. Or it tells you you're higher on agreeableness, it does not tell you you're higher on agreeableness because of this. So while it describes, it doesn't do many of the other really important goals of signs, such as explanation or analysis, for example. Finally, of course, we've learned about the power of the situation in the last unit on social psychology. So if the situation is such a powerful determinant of our behavior, does personality even exist? A known psychologist by the name of Walter Mischel, in a book he called Personality and Assessment. It was a very, very seminal book that caused a stir at the time. Mischel argued that personality simply does not exist, or if it does exist, its role in determining our behavior is relatively negligible. He made this argument on two specific grounds. First, I want you to think of about how we have studied personality so far. We have asked people about their tendencies and about their behavior, of course. Mischel had a lot of doubts about people's ability to actually know themselves at all, to give us an accurate picture about their personality. So that was the first argument that he made against the role of personality in determining behavior. He made a second really important argument, and he said that, and of course this is because he was a contemporary of people like Solomon Asch and his work on conformity, and of course people like Milgram and his work on obedience, and both experiments of course show us the power of the situation and the power of social influences. So Mischel basically doubted that personality had a lot to do with our behavior, simply because Mischel understood the power of the situation. So the situation to Mischel was so powerful in determining our behavior that it basically left no space for personality. So let's talk for a second about how we usually study human personality. As researchers, we can, of course, ask people to tell us. So, for example, we can ask relatives, for example, that know participants very well, to tell us about the personality of that particular participant. We assume here that people that know us well might have a more accurate view of us than we do ourselves. But of course, asking family and friends is a very, very expensive and very difficult endeavor overall. So for the most part, and as mentioned before, what we do is we simply ask people to tell us about their own personalities. There are two ways we can accomplish this task by asking people directly to tell us about their personality. So the first way we can do this is we can ask people to tell us about their personalities using what we call objective self-report measures. And those are basically scales designed to get at personality very directly by simply asking people about the frequency of certain behaviors and the strengths of their preferences. So that's one way of asking people about their personality. There's another way of asking people about their personality, and we call that second way use of projective self-report scales or measures. Projective tests are a more, if you will, discrete way we can assess people's personalities. Projective tests are inspired by psychoanalysis and usually ask participants to describe a very vague stimulus. And in doing so, participants usually project their personality, if you will, onto this vague stimulus to complete the missing parts or make the stimulus relatively clear for themselves. Okay, and here are a few examples. The examples at the top here are objective measures or objective self-report measures of personality. The first is called the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or the MMPI. And then the second example here is the Millen Multi-Axial Clinical Inventory, or the MCMI. Both the MMPI and MCMI are clinically relevant tests of personality that try to map people's personality onto a particular diagnostic category, if you will. So we will discuss the MMPI in a little bit more detail later. At the bottom of your screen here are examples of what we call the projective tests. And here there are a number of examples such as the Rorschach Thematic Apperception Test, or the TAT, set this completion test, and drawing a person test. And these are all examples of projective tests. We will discuss a few of these actually in a bit more detail in a second here. And this is, by the way, an example of the Rorschach ink blot test. So this is one of the items, or one of the stimuli in the Rorschach ink blot test. The Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or the MMPI-2, so there's the MMPI-1 and the MMPI-2, which is a more recent revision of that same scale. So the MMPI was created using a method called criterion keying. Criterion keying is when researchers use a very large number of items and only keep the items that actually help distinguish between two or more groups of people. So for the MMPI-2, participants answer over 500 true or false questions, or true or false format questions. And then researchers see answers to which items can actually distinguish between, for example, a group of depressed patients and a group of healthy controls. There are a number of different clinical features of personality that the scale assesses for, and items within each of the subscales of the MMPI are actually grouped according to what psychological condition they're attempting to address or attempting to assess. Here is a list of these clinical scales that make up the MMPI. You definitely don't need to remember the names of all these clinical scales, but just understand the purpose behind them and the purpose behind the MMPI, generally speaking. Okay, so it's a very large set of items that distinguish between groups of people. Usually speaking, it's groups of healthy controls versus some kind of a diagnostic group of people with a diagnostic category, such as anxiety, depression, etc. And then the items, or the answers to these items, distinguishes between these groups and hence are kept in the MMPI. There have been a number of criticisms launched against the MMPI-1 and its revision MMPI-2. First, people have wondered about the validity of the clinical subscale. That is, does the subscale of depression, for example, in the MMPI, does the subscale of depression actually measure depression as it purports? And some questions kind of put to question that idea that the scale is valid or actually measures what it purports to measure. Also notice some of the outdated terminology still in use within the scale. Okay, so we have things such as hysteria, which literally is translated as the wandering womb, which is this really sexist, outdated term that we simply don't use anymore. Things such as masculinity, femininity, things such as hypochondriasis, which was a condition in the DSM-4, but is no longer a condition in the DSM-5. So the MMPI uses a lot of very outdated language, and that reflects how long ago it was made. And it was actually, the second revision was made in the 1980s, so it's really quite dated. And then the other criticism is the fact that the MMPI tends to show higher rates of psychopathology, especially for non-white respondents who are taking the scale, which actually signals that the scale might be culturally biased in some way, or at least the norming sample, or the sample to which we compare the results of the test. The norming sample was not representative of non-whites very well. Let's now talk about the Rorschach ink blot test, which is a type of projective testing. The test was developed by Hermann Rorschach, who in the 1940s, as you can probably imagine as a psychiatrist living at that time, he was very much inspired by Freudian psychoanalysis. So he wanted to develop a test of personality that would partially bypass conscious control, if you will. It is usually administered to patients as a test of imagination. And participants are usually asked to look at and examine ink blots, which the ink blots look something like this. And answer the question of what might this be? There are 10 cards in total, and are viewed, the series of 10 cards are viewed twice. And there are prompts that the therapist gives in the second administration. On the first administration, the therapist usually asks no question at all, or no questions at all, and the respondent is simply free associating whatever that comes to mind that relates to the image. Again, the idea behind this particular test, much like other projective tests, is that the stimuli in the cards, they're so vague, right? So if you look at the cards here, they're extremely vague that people have to project their own personalities onto the images to try and decipher what they are. In doing so, how about you stop the video right here and ask yourself the question, what might this be? The thematic apperception test is very similar to the Rorschach, as it also is also a projective form of personality testing. Again, participants are presented with 10 cards that depict a very vague social scene, if you will. And then the respondents are asked to describe this social scene in as much detail as they can. Let's do an example. Who are the people here? What are they doing? What are they thinking or feeling? What led up to this scene? And how do you think it will work out? I want you now to think as fast as you can and complete these sentences in your mind. I failed. I want to know. I regret. Boys. What annoys me. This is the Rotter incomplete sentence test, which is another form of projective test which simply asks respondents to complete missing statements such as these ones. There have been a number of criticisms that have been launched against projective tests. Unfortunately, the studies that have tried to get at projective tests' validity, which is whether the test actually measures what it purports to measure, and projective tests' reliability, which is the consistency of the scores across time and across different situations. So most tests of the scale's validity and reliability show that most of these scales have poor validity and poor reliability, unfortunately, which makes us wonder if they're actually measuring what they purport to measure at all, namely personality. There have been systems that have been actually created to standardize the administration and interpretation of these particular projective tests. But unfortunately, they're often very expensive and really difficult to find. And for that reason, most therapists who use these projective scales unfortunately don't use any of these standardized programs that do enhance or show to enhance validity and reliability. Finally, and much like the MMPI, tests such as the Rorschach tend to over-pathologize people generally. So the tests or sometimes show that people have some kind of a psychological condition or psychological distress when they don't actually have these conditions or these signs of distress. There is a problem with the testing of personality generally. And these problems of self-report measures generally, they're present in either projective forms of personality testing or objective self-report measures of personality. This is because, as Walter Mischel hinted, people are not always very good at telling us about themselves, unfortunately. So they sometimes emphasize positive features of themselves or their personalities and downplay negative features of their personalities. So this is what psychologists call faking good. Think about it. If you made a dating app profile and you're likely to use this dating app, you're going to probably use one of the very best pictures of yourself as your profile picture, since of course you want to put your very best foot forward. There's also the opposite problem of people faking good, which is faking bad or malingering. And this is when people try to show that try to mask any psychological distress or problems that they may actually have. So this is a common problem in custody battles or any kind of a legal dispute over money, for example. People sometimes malinger or fake bad, so they report their symptoms are actually worse than they are. There are other issues with personality testing that are not necessarily conscious. So people may randomly respond, for example. Or they may do the test while not paying very much attention or under the influence of some kind of drugs, which ultimately, of course, hurts the validity of the scale. For this reason, researchers who develop these personality tests sometimes have what are called validity tests built right into them. And these validity tests include items within them that are designed specifically to catch people who may be faking good or bad, or people who may be responding completely at random. Until next time.